Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. So I'm going to talk about ridge regression and some deterministic ridge leverage score sampling. And so just a little bit about me. I'm a statistical geneticist at Ancestry.com, but today I'll be talking about work I did as a postdoc, and this work is on this topic. And the work was published in NeurIPS in 2018, so I think some of you have heard about this work before, so thank you for listening a second time. So the motivation is that we have moderately big data in the high-dimensional regime. So what I mean by moderately big is that you can do all the storage and computations on a single machine. And in the high-dimensional regime, we have many more features than we do samples. Oop, wrong direction. So I have a short and fat matrix, A, which is how I'm going to arrange my data matrix, where I have D features. And since I'm biologically motivated, you can think of these features as things like single nucleotide polymorphisms, which are called SNPs, or features that relate to gene expression, or copy number variation, mutations, methylation. These are just all biological signals that you can get from a sample, which might be an individual or cells. And in biological applications, we typically have, or we can frequently end up in the regime where we have more features than we do samples. So let me show you some data from an actual application here. So this is lower grade glioma, which is a type of brain cancer, and there are 274 tumors, and you can get, say, around 70,000 features collected from different biological assays on these 300 or so samples. And if you do PCA on this feature set, you see that there is a low dimensional representation here that looks like this of all of your samples. And I've colored these samples by a particular classification of these tumors into 3 different types. And for the purposes of this talk, you can just see that the yellow type separates well from the green and the blue types. So you can imagine that you want to use these features to do a regression problem. And since you're in the high-dimensional regime, you need to regularize your problem with ridge regression. And you could try to predict whether or not you're one of the yellow points from whether or not you're one of the green and the blue points. Now, of course, in this particular case, this is just a naive proof of concept. You probably wouldn't actually do regression. You'd probably do some form of logistic regression, but my results are about regression, so we're just going to go ahead and proceed with this somewhat naive example as a motivator for the theoretical results in this talk. So you can see that if you use all of these features, you can actually do relatively well at this prediction problem. But did you really need to use all 70,000 of these features to do well at prediction? And could you have instead used only a subset of your features and had still perhaps good performance guarantees? So that's the motivation for the work that I'm going to be talking about with you today. So I'm going to introduce leverage. It's been introduced before in this workshop, but I'm going to go for it again. I'm going to talk a little bit about deterministic versus random, just give you an overview on the bounds without going into the proofs, and show you a little bit more of the experimental data. So that's the plan. So the classical leverage scores are statistical leverage scores. So they quantify the importance of each column I for the range space of our data matrix A. And remember here, we have n rows and d columns. And so we are looking at d leverage scores, right? So in the normal set, or in the statistical setup, frequently leverage scores, as we've heard in other talks, they have been used to select informative samples, right? So to select the informative samples in the n direction, we're going to use leverage scores to select informative features in the d direction. So let's see. So this interpretation of leverage scores is an interpretation of them as a minimization problem. And what this interpretation does is it shows that it shows the importance. It shows that it shows that one of the things that leverage is measuring is the importance of each column I in the range space of your matrix in the column space of A. And it also shows why your leverage scores is sensitive to things like collinearity in your data, because if you have if your single column can be written as a linear combination of many other columns, your leverage score will decrease. So this there are other equivalent formulas for leverage, and the more perhaps common one is written as this formula, which I've just had appear here. Sorry. The mouse. So here the leverage is written as the norm of each column with respect to a non-Euclidean norm constructed from the inverse of or the pseudo-inverse in the case that the matrix is rank deficient, where your norm is your semi-norm. So sorry, a little nervous. So one important thing to realize about this representation of your leverage scores is that if you recall from your singular value decomposition from your matrix A, in terms of three matrices U, sigma, and V, you can also write your leverage scores as the sum over your right singular vectors up to the rank of the matrix. The sum of the entries of your singular right singular vector squared up to the rank of the matrix. And so why does this matter? Well, maybe not all singular vectors are important for our problem. So perhaps we don't care about singular vectors with small singular values. So if we are in the case where we take our singular vectors, we take our singular values and we order them in decreasing value, spread out by rank, maybe all of the mass or a lot of the mass is concentrated at our top singular vectors. And so we should maybe treat the rest of the singular values differently. And so there's two things that you could do. One would be to omit the lower singular values. The other would be to dilute them. So if you omit them, then you're calculating a rank K subspace leverage score introduced by these folks here. And so there, when you are calculating the distance when you're calculating the distances with respect to your Euclidean semi-norm, instead of using your full data matrix A, you are using its rank K approximation. And so you can imagine as a visualization, you have sphere-sized your data points, and each point here is a column in your original data matrix, and the leverage score is the radius to each column. And so this is like a nice geometric interpretation of your leverage scores and shows that you're choosing your leverage scores that are sort of far out from the origin. You're choosing columns with leverage scores that are far out from the origin. But you could take the other tactic, which is that you could dilute your leverage scores instead of just omitting the direction. You could dilute the importance of the singular vectors with small leverage scores rather than omitting them entirely. And so the way that you do this is by adding a regularization parameter, lambda 2. And so for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to go ahead and fix that regularization constant lambda 2 to be the sum of the Frobenius norm squared of the singular values that are greater than a particular k that you've chosen to be informative for your data. And so when you do that, the directions with small eigenvalues count proportionally less than the ones with large eigenvalues. And this is a more stable thing to do than omitting the directions that have small eigenvalues entirely. So you can draw a similar picture than you did before. So this is the dilution. And so, yes, and so now your sum, rather than stopping at the rank k, which you have the rank k in the case of rank k leverage scores, it goes all the way out to n, or the rank of your, to rank n, to n, which is the sample dimension of your matrix. So you can draw a similar picture of your leverage scores, where now you have a slightly different Euclidean, slightly different semi-norm that sort of stretches the axes of each of your directions. And so now, if you were to look at circles of constant leverage, those are ellipses. Sorry, you have ellipses of constant leverage rather than circles of constant leverage. So I have introduced to you 3 different concepts of leverage, and so now I'm just going to talk really briefly about deterministic versus randomized algorithms. So we're interested in selecting columns from our matrix and using those to create a new smaller matrix C that preserves these nice properties of our total data matrix A. So why might we want to look at a deterministic algorithm rather than a randomized algorithm? And this is for the same reason that we're choosing columns in the first place, which is that if we're biologically motivated, then we're interested in the interpretability of our columns. So a column might represent a gene, and we don't want a random selection of genes to go look at if we're interested in doing a biology experiment. We want to know which genes to look at specifically for our next experiment. So we get the same results every time. There's no failure probability. And then under certain conditions, you can show better bounds. So what is a deterministic sampling algorithm? So this sampling algorithm is based on a sampling algorithm for rank k subspace leverage scores. So basically what you do is for your data matrix, you go ahead and you calculate your ridge. You decide on a rank k, which is important to your problem. You calculate your ridge leverage scores for all of your columns. You line up all of your leverage scores in decreasing order, and then you decide on a threshold, and below that threshold you include all of your columns, and above that threshold you reject all of your columns. And the error in your later algorithms add up to the area under the curve of your leverage scores and your column rank. So essentially you choose columns outside of a radius tau up until the sum of the taus inside of this ellipse have a small enough error to satisfy your problem.
That's expensive, right?
Yes.
So you have to compute an SVD and then the leverage score.
Yes, and so that's one of the reasons why I said that this was relevant for moderately sized data. So the results that I have here are for exact leverage scores, but there has been work by people in this audience showing that you might be able to do well if you approximate a leverage score and then iterate.
Well, probably you may as well do a strong rank revealing QR, right? To get the linearly independent columns.
So these columns aren't linearly independent, actually. So like if you have, this doesn't select linearly independent columns.
So what's the objective of your column subset selection algorithm?
The objective is, sorry, say that one more time.
Yeah, so you're doing column subset selection, right? So
Mm-hmm.
what columns? What should
Yeah,
I
so
do?
I think the question is, maybe I can turn that a little bit on its head. So like, you can define an objective and then come up with an algorithm that satisfies this objective, or you can have an algorithm and say, if I apply this algorithm, what properties will my solution satisfy? And so what I'm going to do is tell you next what sort of bounds you can derive if you follow this deterministic greedy procedure of just selecting the high-ranking columns according to leverage scores, where your error is the sum of the leverage of the remaining
I
columns.
just thought you had a genetic problem there and you wanted something with your genetic data, so.
Yeah, yeah.
So
Oh, so what is my genetic objective?
Yeah.
My genetic objective is to do meaningful feature selection to reduce the size of my problem and find, and then with that meaningful interpretable subset of columns, do well in ridge regression.
So why is the traditional column subset selection not good enough?
So
Just wondering.
So the traditional column subset selection algorithms often don't you mean the randomized algorithms or the deterministic?
Strong rank revealing QR, for example. Well, never mind, we can talk about it later.
But one point, so on the example that you gave us,
Yeah.
I think what n was 274. So
Yeah.
it's a very small number. So even though p was 68,000, the SVD even in MATLAB would be incredibly fast.
Oh yeah, the analytics for this did not take a long time.
Yeah, so even if QR wasn't wrong.
But rank revealing QR gives a worse approximation guarantees than leverage scores, right?
I beg your pardon?
Like strong rank revealing QR will give worse approximations,
Why?
whereas a low rank approximation on
No,
leverage
it gives you bounds on the low and upper bounds on the single.
Yeah, but you
rank.
get much tighter ones from leverage scores, right? So
I don't know.
we can talk about it after.
Right.
But I think there are settings when matrices could be better or well approximated by a subset of column select via leverage square than via strong rank revealing QR.
But I don't think they have stronger singular value bounds. They may have other bounds, but not the singular value bounds, I think.
The point I wanted to make is that for problems of this size, SVD is fine. SVD, you know.
But you want columns, right? You
Yeah,
don't-
but economy-sized SVD.
But so then you have to do follow Kleber's steward algorithm, the right singular vectors to do column selection. You don't want a dominant subspace, right? You want to select the meaningful the features over it.
But it'll be fast. I mean, I don't think that's a constraint.
Well, you're saying even if you apply, I don't know if you understand something, but even if you applied the QR algorithm to select the columns, in a bunch of downstream use cases, it actually does better if you apply it to be transposed than to the original matrix.
Okay, fine.
Because the
Sure.
columns are more
That's
spread out and less
follow
aligned,
Kleber's
so-
steward, yeah.
Oh, they did this? Okay.
It's an unpublished tech report, but they did that.
Oh, we have something unpublished on that, so.
So what properties does this algorithm have? Or if you run this algorithm, what properties does the solution have? Well, what are some properties that we could care about? So one would be a spectral bound, which is a powerful tool. I'll talk about these all a little bit more in the next slide. Another would be column subset selection, which is frequently used for feature selection. Another would be rank K projection cost preservation. This is nice for projections and K-means. And then lastly, you might ask, well, like, how does this compare to the number of columns selected, deterministic versus randomized algorithms, both using the same leverage scores? So the nice thing is that this deterministic algorithm actually satisfies all of these bounds, which are listed here. And so it satisfies a spectral bound, which is an additive multiplicative spectral bound. And so this gives us nice, ordering of our matrices. So here C is the subsampled column matrix. So this gives us orderings on eigenvalues and traces and distances. And there's like conjugation rules that are nice. So this spectral bound is very powerful, not only for itself, but also because you can use it to derive other things. You can also, You also get the column subset selection bound, the projection cost preservation, and if you fix the number of columns, you can get, sorry, the technical difficulties are a little bit challenging. This is not my computer.
You need a pointer? There was a pointer somewhere.
No, I'm actually looking for the mouse, which has disappeared.
I see it on the screen, so maybe it's not on the screen.
Oh, it's on the screen.
Now you're
Ah, that explains it. Thank you. Appreciated. When the leverage scores, so I set up this problem where you had your columns and you sorted them according to leverage scores, and I showed in a very leading picture that there was this decay of your leverage score with column rank. And this decay, if it is power law, you can actually drive various bounds on the numbers of columns selected with the same for the same error. Sorry, I said that backwards. So like if you fix your error in your algorithm, then you can actually choose fewer number of columns using this deterministic algorithm. But what it requires is that you have a strict and quick drop-off in your leverage score with column rank. And so this particular bound here is for power law decay. So returning to our challenge, we were looking to select columns of our matrix A and create a new matrix which preserved these nice properties. And so far I've talked with you about unsupervised properties of our data matrix itself. But what if we look at supervised properties of our problem? So here we imagine that we not only have our data matrix A, but we also have an outcome Y. And we're going to do ridge regression on this data. And so ridge regression regularizes our ill-posed linear least squares problems. So we have an estimation of our coefficients, which are the x hat. We have our fixed design matrix, which is A. We have our coefficients, which are x, and our outcome, which is y. And we have an estimate for our coefficients, which are x hat. And then we also have our estimate for our outcome, which is y hat. And so ridge regression is nice because there is this explicit solution for the answer. And so in the ridge regression problems that I'll be talking about, we're going to go ahead and choose the same regularization here that we have chosen for our features for our column subset selection algorithm, our deterministic column subset selection algorithm. And so when we look at this problem, what we'd like to analyze is the regression risk. So we're going to take a model for data generation, which is that our data Y is generated from our fixed design matrix times some unknown coefficients, which we're trying to estimate, plus Gaussian noise. And so the risk of the estimator is this particular quantity. And so we'd like to ask, can we bound the risk of using our column sample matrix C instead of A in the regression problem? And so I'd just like to point out that this situation is a little bit different from the ones that have been talked about previously in this workshop, because instead of sampling samples, we are sampling features, right? So our sketching matrix essentially is getting inserted between A and X, whereas previously talks have talked about inserting a sketching matrix on the left side of A. So you can decompose the risk of your regression risk into two pieces. There's a bias piece and a variance piece. And I won't go ahead and walk through the proofs, but just to let you know, the spectral bound is extremely important for being able to prove this bound on the risk of the estimator, and you also need to use your projection cost preservation bounds. And it turns out that the variance piece is a little bit easier to prove than the bias piece in this particular case. And so then this is the bound that I get, that your risk of the estimator is less than 1 plus beta times epsilon. So if using your smaller matrix is 1 plus epsilon, less than 1 plus epsilon times your risk of using your full matrix to do the regression problem. And beta and alpha and beta are both constants. Alpha is around 7, and beta, I think, is around 62. So you can compare to elastic net. So this is interesting. This ridge regression problem is interesting because with the deterministic column selection is interesting because it sort of forces sparsity in your feature space, even though what you're doing is, so by selecting columns ahead of time, you're essentially zeroing out some of your features. And so you get both sparsity as well as the shrinkage factor that you normally get from ridge regression. And so elastic net is an interesting comparison because there you get shrinkage from the L2 normalization, but you get sparsity from the L1 normalization. So you can compare the two risks and find a point where they are equal. So on to experiments. Back to the motivating example that I gave you at the beginning. If you
that looked like it wasn't better or worse, it's sort of incomparable to the elastic net,
yeah.
Depending on all these parameters.
Yes, I would say. Sorry, here, going forward. So you can just a little bit deeper dive into the data example, which I showed you in the beginning. If you apply this procedure, this deterministic sampling algorithm with k equals 3 and epsilon at 0.1, you keep 1,500 rather than 70,000 features. And so the reason why I chose 3 is that k less than or equal to 3 has around 80% of your Frobenius norm. So this is heavily weighted in your top eigenvalues. The results on fixed error and fewer columns relied on a power law fit to your leverage scores. And so you can see from this plot that actually pretty far out, the power law fit is a good approximation to the leverage scores on real data. And then also you can see in this plot that maybe it's not the best visualization, but as you increase, let's see, so as you increase the error, you can see that the number of columns that you keep decreases dramatically. And if you're interested in the shrinkage properties, this is a plot of your ridge leverage scores compared to your classical leverage scores calculated for the same data matrix. And you can see that many of your classical leverage scores get shrunk quite close to 0. So this is the PCA, which I have already showed you. And this is the prediction problem. So here is the prediction, the prediction. So you're doing a regression problem. So this is the histogram of the regression outcomes conditioned on whether or not you are one of the two classes. And this is the difference, which is very tightly peaked in your actual regression outcome from using your large matrix versus your small matrix. So basically in practice, this actually works pretty well. So in conclusion, I've talked with you a little bit about leverage scores and ridge leverage scores, deterministic versus randomized algorithms. So I've showed you some bounds and some experimental data. I think that there are really interesting open directions that still remain. So this was all done for a very specific ridge regression parameter. And the question is, could this be relaxed at all? The rank K projection cost preservation relies on this regression parameter, but perhaps there's ways of loosening it. And I think also, so this was all done with a linear kernel, but you could imagine trying to generalize this to kernel ridge regression, where instead of trying to pick informative samples in your kernel ridge regression, you're trying to subset your feature space. So I think that there are very interesting open questions, and I really appreciate everybody's attention. And I finished
Any other
early.
question? Yeah.
So about this comparison of the two kinds of leverage scores, in general, I'm kind of interested in the variance of leverage scores. So you have this point that's way out here.
Yeah, I don't have an explanation for that point.
Yeah, like
This
the
over there.
0.4 versus, yeah, on that side.
Yeah, sorry, it's
I mean, at this point,
there.
not that.
Yeah, the ones in the top row and
That guy, those ones.
Like this one?
yeah.
Yeah.
Like did you try to interpret what these are, or?
I don't have an interpretation for those 2 points, the ones that seem to be very different, but I think that that's a great thing for me to take a look at. Yeah.
Petra saw in genetics that a lot of the large leverage things correlated pretty strongly with what geneticists saw as informativeness. I wouldn't be surprised if you cut at 0.8, there was a strong correlation with something that was meaningful in that sense.
Yes, that is the motivation for doing this, is that the leverage points are driving both the structure of your matrix, and then you see that you can actually get good prediction value out of these, even though you've sort of culled your feature space agnostic from your outcome, right? You've only used the structure of your data as a whole to pick your informative features. But yeah, I do think that that's a great question to follow up on. Yeah.
So I think in one of your slides, you had roughly k over epsilon squared columns selected, assuming a power law.
Yeah.
Would it be possible to do some kind of like two-stage sampling to get like roughly k over epsilon for column subset selection if you still do deterministic sampling?
So here.
Yeah.
So sorry. So I didn't explain this very well. But so are you talking about this side here?
Yeah.
So this is actually the number of columns. So for fixed error, this is the number of columns that you get from the randomized algorithm. And this left-hand side is actually the number of columns that you get from your deterministic algorithm. And so there are regimes in which this quantity is less. So you choose fewer columns for deterministic algorithms than you do for the randomized algorithm with fixed error. And I'm sorry I didn't explain that clearly.
All right, so I think we have a break now, so let's thank Shannon again. And